Freshers' Week is supposed to be the time of your life. New faces, new friends, and an endless string of parties. For me, it was more than that. It was a fresh start, a chance to be noticed. I never thought one night would change everything. The first time I saw her was at a pub crawl in town. She wasn't like the other girls, loud and desperate for attention. She was quieter, standing slightly apart from her group, but still part of the crowd. There was something about her that drew me in. Maybe the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, or the way she seemed almost out of place amidst the chaos. I didn't hesitate to approach her, thinking this was my moment. She didn't seem overly keen to talk, but maybe she's just shy. Some people take time to warm up. She smiled politely, said she had to get back to her friends, and left me standing there. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than she let on. I followed her around the pub, casually at first, trying to figure out if she was just playing hard to get or genuinely uninterested. When she still didn't give me much attention, I decided to back off for a bit. No point pushing too hard too fast. Later in the night, I saw her again, this time outside, waiting for a taxi. She looked a bit unsteady on her feet, her laughter slurring. It annoyed me a little to think she'd brush me off, but seemed so open with her friends. When her taxi pulled up, I felt this sudden urge to speak to her again, to convince her I wasn't like the others. Before I even realized what I was doing, I followed her to the cab and jumped in after her. Her reaction startled me. She screamed, and the driver wasted no time yanking me out. I hit the pavement hard, embarrassed and furious. As the taxi sped off, I shouted after her that I'd see her at uni. I wasn't going to let one night ruin the chance to get to know her properly. The next few weeks were a blur of lectures, seminars, and endless attempts to find her. I didn't even know her name, which made things harder. I kept an eye out at every fresher event, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. I started hanging around the halls and common areas more often, watching the crowds, trying to piece together which group she might be part of. Sometimes I'd stay near the student union or outside the library, places I thought she might frequent. It became frustrating how elusive she was. I'd catch myself staring at other girls, thinking I'd spotted her, only to realize it wasn't her. The image of her face was burned into my mind, and the more I couldn't find her, the more determined I became. I even started skipping my own social plans, spending nights wandering the campus instead, hoping for a chance encounter. Finally spotted her. She was walking across campus, her head down, earphones in, carrying a tote bag. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't risk scaring her off again. Our favorite teacher, Miss Hayes, disappeared halfway through the school day, and nobody seemed to care except for us, her students. I can't explain how unsettling it was, but even now I can't stop thinking about it. Miss Hayes was one of those teachers everyone loved. She made boring subjects interesting and actually cared about her students. That day, everything seemed fine. She taught her morning classes as usual, joking with us and giving us homework we'd probably moan about later. She left for her lunch break, just like always, but she didn't come back. The afternoon bell rang, and another teacher from the school showed up in her place without mentioning Miss Hayes. Maybe Miss Hayes was unwell, or had to leave unexpectedly. It wasn't until the next day that things started to become strange. A brand new teacher was standing in front of the class, introducing herself as if she'd been hired weeks ago. When we asked about Miss Hayes, saying she was our new teacher from now on, no explanation, no goodbye. The weirdest part was how the rest of the staff acted. When we asked other teachers about Miss Hayes, they didn't seem to know who we were talking about. They'd frown, confused, and tell us they'd never heard of her. It felt like some weird joke. But the more we pushed, the more it became clear they genuinely didn't remember her. It wasn't just the staff. When we tried to find her name in the school directory, it wasn't there. Her email address was gone. Even her nameplate on the classroom door had been replaced overnight. It was like she'd been erased. A few of us decided to dig deeper. We looked for photos from school events where she'd been present, checked old schedules, and even tried to find her social media. Nothing, no trace of her anywhere. We started whispering about it among ourselves, sharing little things we remembered about her that no one else seemed to. Like the way she'd always bring in pastries for us during exams, or how she'd doodle on the whiteboard when explaining a hard topic. It felt like we were holding onto fragments of someone no one else believed existed. One of the students in our class swore he saw her car still parked outside the school the day she vanished. Another claimed to have heard someone crying in the staff room during lunch. None of us knew what to do with these bits of information. Every attempt to get answers led to dead ends. We even asked our parents if they remembered meeting her during parent-teacher nights, but most of them couldn't recall her at all. The new teacher, though, was another story. She was cold, distant, and acted like she'd been there forever. She didn't seem to like when we brought up Miss Hayes either. The few times someone dared to mention her name in class, the new teacher would cut them off sharply and move on. It's been a few months now, and some of my classmates are starting to slowly forget her, but I won't. You know how people say kids can be their own worst enemies? That's exactly what I think about whenever someone brings up that summer, the one where we all got a bit too curious and a lot too stupid. It still haunts me, even now, and I don't think I'll ever fully shake it. It was the summer holidays and we were bored out of our minds. Nothing to do, nowhere to go, just endless days of trying to entertain ourselves. That's how the old school came up. Everyone knew about it, the abandoned one near the edge of town. It had been shut down for years, just this creepy, crumbling building no one cared about anymore. Perfect for a bit of fun, or so we thought. There were 4 of us that night. Me, Jack, Sam, and Owen. We waited until it was properly dark, sneaking out with torches and no real plan except to see what was inside. The place looked even worse up close, like something out of a horror film. Broken windows, graffiti everywhere, bits of the roof caving in. It should have put us off, but it just made it more exciting. Getting in wasn't hard. Someone had already smashed a window and we crawled through, careful not to cut ourselves. Inside, it was pure chaos. Desks and chairs piled up, old textbooks mouldering away, the smell of damp and rot everywhere. We joked around a bit, pretending we were on some big adventure, but I could tell we were all a bit nervous. We wandered around for a while, exploring classrooms and corridors. There was so much stuff left behind. Blackboards with faded writing, shelves still stacked with dusty books, even old lunchboxes that had been forgotten. It was weird, like time had just stopped in there. Then the noises started. It was just little things, faint creaks, maybe the wind, stuff you'd expect in an old building. But then there was a banging sound, loud enough to make us all freeze. It came from somewhere down the corridor, but when we shone our torches, there was nothing there. We tried to convince ourselves it was just some animal. We should have left then, but we didn't. We kept going, sticking close together. And that's when it happened. Jack screamed. I mean, full-on, blood-curdling scream, and then he was gone. 1 second he was right next to me, and the next there was nothing. No sign of him, no sound, nothing. We shouted his name, running down the corridor, our torches darting everywhere. There was no sign of him. We panicked, sprinting blindly through the school, calling for Jack. But then Sam screamed, and just like that, he was gone too. Owen and I didn't stop this time. We just ran, tearing through the halls, our hearts pounding like mad. Every sound felt like it was coming for us. Footsteps that didn't belong to us, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Then Owen screamed and I was alone. I ended up in a room with a smashed window. I didn't stop to think, I just dove through it, cutting my hands on the glass but not caring. I hit the ground and ran as fast as I could, not stopping until I was home. When I finally looked back, I saw at the smashed window there was a figure, tall, dark and completely still. It didn't chase me, didn't do anything. It just stood there watching. Then it turned and disappeared back into the school. I told my parents everything, barely able to get the words out. They called the police, and there was a whole search party the next day. They didn't find anything. No Jack, no Sam, no Owen, just a few scuff marks on the floor like someone had been dragged. That's all. People still talk about the old school sometimes, but I can't bear to hear it. I know what happened. I don't know what that thing was, but I know it's still there, waiting. You ever had that feeling like something's just wrong, but you can't put your finger on it? That's what it felt like when we first noticed the yearbook photos. It wasn't just weird, it was chilling, like stepping into some sort of bad dream you can't wake up from. It all started during our last week of school. You know how it is. Everyone signing yearbooks, writing stupid jokes, and saying they'll stay in touch even though they probably won't. We were flipping through the pages during lunch, laughing at old photos when I noticed there were gaps. Not literal empty spaces, but whole people were missing. I thought it was just an oversight, maybe a printing error or something, but the more we looked, the more it stood out. We were missing classmates, and it wasn't just a couple. There were enough gone that it didn't feel random. But here's the thing, no one else seemed to notice. Teachers, other students, even the principal, acted like everything was completely normal. None of the missing people's names were called at assembly when they listed off seniors. No one mentioned them, not even their supposed best friends. It was like they'd never existed, but I remembered. We all did, me, Jamie, Tara, and Ben. We sat there listing them off, matching faces to memories, group projects, parties, even awkward moments in class. They were real. They had been there. It wasn't just us, the yearbook, though. That's what really got to us. Their lockers were empty, cleared out like they'd never been used. Their names weren't on any class lists anymore. I even checked my old phone for texts and couldn't find anything. No photos with them, no group chats that used to include them. But I knew we'd talked. I remembered specific conversations, private jokes they'd made. It was like reality had been scrubbed clean of them. Jamie suggested we start asking around, maybe someone else had noticed. So we started subtly dropping questions about people like Rachel or Chris. But every time, we got the same blank stares. Who? Like we were the crazy ones. Even their parents seemed off. I tried talking to Chris's mum once when I bumped into her at the shop, and she looked right through me like she didn't even recognize her own son's name. That's when we realized we were alone in this. No one else remembered them. No one else seemed bothered. It was just us. And the more we pushed, the worse it got. Jamie thought it might be some kind of cover-up, maybe some twisted conspiracy. Tara was convinced it was something supernatural, though she couldn't explain why we'd been left out of whatever was happening. Things started escalating after that. One night, Jamie called, panicked. He swore he'd seen Rachel outside his house, just standing there watching him. He tried to go outside, but by the time he got there, she was gone. I thought he was just stressed, imagining things, but then Ben said he'd heard Chris's voice coming from the woods near his house. It didn't make sense. They were gone, weren't they? And then Tara disappeared. One day she was with us trying to figure out what was going on. The next she was just gone. Her name was wiped from the yearbook, her desk in class was empty, and no one else remembered her, except us, or at least the three of us who were left. We were terrified. If it could happen to Tara, it could happen to any of us. Jamie and Ben wanted to keep digging, but I was too scared. I started keeping my distance, thinking maybe that would keep me safe. Then Jamie disappeared. And then Ben. Now it's just me. Their faces are gone from the yearbook. Their names don't exist in any school record. No one else remembers them, but I do. Every single one of them. I've stopped asking questions, stopped looking for answers. Whatever this is, I don't want it to notice me too. When Mr. Calloway arrived as the new principal at our school, it felt like the dawn of a new era. Our school had been struggling for years, failing test scores, constant fights, and a revolving door of disinterested staff. But within months of his arrival, everything changed. Grades soared, the hallways felt calmer, and suddenly we were being recognized as one of the top schools in the district. It was like he had worked some kind of miracle. Everyone was thrilled. Mr. Calloway was charismatic, with a commanding presence that made you want to sit up straighter and do your best. Teachers who had once seemed apathetic were now inspired and pushing us harder than ever. Even the slackers in my year started pulling their weight. The school was winning awards left and right, and for the first time there was a real sense of pride in being part of it. But then the disappearances started. The first few kids who vanished weren't exactly the type anyone would immediately miss. A boy in year 10 who was always skipping class. A girl in year 8 who had been suspended multiple times for fighting. They'd stop showing up, and the rumor mill would churn out stories about how they'd dropped out or transferred schools. Nobody really questioned it. This sort of thing happened all the time before Mr. Calloway arrived. But it didn't stop there. A few staff members left abruptly too. One of the dinner ladies, then the chemistry teacher. Each time there was an explanation. They'd moved on to a new job or needed time to care for a sick relative. Still, it felt strange. There was no goodbye party, no final words. They were just gone. What really started to unsettle me was when some of the students who disappeared weren't the usual suspects. One boy, Liam, was quiet but not troublesome, just not particularly bright. He struggled in most of his classes, but he was always kind and tried his best. One day he stopped coming to school. His parents said he'd been sent to a private program to help him reach his potential, but nobody knew the details. The same thing happened to a girl in my maths class. She wasn't bad at school, but she had trouble keeping up. When I asked her friend where she'd gone, they just shrugged and said her parents had pulled her out. It was around this time that I noticed a pattern. Every student or staff member who vanished had one thing in common. They were underperforming in some way. Whether it was poor grades, bad behavior, or simply not excelling, they were all falling short of the new standards Mr. Calloway had brought in. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. The disappearances weren't random. I started paying closer attention to Mr. Calloway and the way he always seemed to know everything about everyone. He would appear out of nowhere if you were slacking off, his eyes cold. He had this way of looking at you that made you feel small, like he was assessing your worth. For the first time, I felt genuinely afraid of him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was going on. I tried bringing it up with a friend, but they laughed it off, saying I was just being paranoid. The school was better than it had ever been. Why question it? But I noticed they started working harder in class after that conversation, almost like they were afraid of being next. The final straw came when one of my closest friends, Emily, vanished. She wasn't failing, but she'd been struggling to keep up with the workload ever since the school's standards had shot up. One day she just didn't show up. Her parents told me she'd been sent to a boarding school for extra support, but they looked nervous when they said it, like they didn't entirely believe it themselves. Her desk in class was cleared out by the next morning. I'm telling this now because I can't keep it bottled up anymore. I don't know what's happening at my school, but it's not normal. Mr. Calloway has turned everything around, but at what cost? How can we be proud of our success when it's built on the disappearance of our classmates and teachers? Every day I feel like I'm walking on a knife's edge, terrified of slipping up and catching his attention. Part of me wants to confront him, to demand answers, but the other part of me knows better. I don't want to be next. It started out as a normal Monday at our school, but by the end of the day, no one could explain what had happened. I'm a teacher at a secondary school, and I've been working there for years. Things don't usually go off the rails like this, so it's stuck with me ever since. Our usual Year 9 English teacher, Mrs. Barnes, called in sick. She rarely takes time off, so everyone figured she must have been feeling pretty awful. On Monday morning, the timetable showed a substitute had been assigned to her classes. That's nothing unusual, it happens all the time, but none of us recognized the name of the sub. Mr. Grayson was listed, and we assumed he was a new hire or someone called in last minute. When I saw him in the staff room before first period, he seemed normal enough. He was tall, in his late 40s or early 50s, with neatly combed hair and glasses. He introduced himself to a few of us, saying he'd been subbing for years, and we didn't think much of it. He seemed polite, even a bit soft-spoken, and I thought he'd fit in fine, but things started to go wrong almost immediately. By mid-morning, I heard some of the students talking about how their new substitute was strict and weird. That's not exactly a red flag. It's hard for anyone to step into Mrs. Barnes's shoes, as she's one of the most patient and understanding teachers we have. I figured Mr. Grayson was just trying to establish authority, as subs often do. Then the complaints started coming in. During break, several students approached me in the corridor saying Mr. Grayson had been shouting at their class over minor things like not having pens ready or whispering to one another during work time. One of the kids was nearly in tears, saying he'd called her lazy and useless in front of everyone when she didn't know an answer. That didn't sit right with me, but I was in the middle of prepping for my own lesson and decided I'd check in on his class later. By lunchtime, things had escalated. A couple of other teachers mentioned that Mr. Grayson had been short with them, snapping at questions or ignoring greetings altogether. One of the teaching assistants who'd popped into his classroom said he was pacing up and down the rows of desks, muttering under his breath and glaring at the students. She said the atmosphere in the room was tense, and the kids looked terrified. At this point, I started to get a bad feeling. During afternoon lessons, I overheard one of the Year 9s crying in the corridor. She said Mr. Grayson had torn up her homework in front of the class because it wasn't good enough. I decided enough was enough and went to find a member of the administration team to raise my concerns. By this point, the story had already spread, and they decided to confront him. When the head teacher and deputy head went to Mrs. Barnes's classroom, they found the door locked. It took several minutes of knocking before Mr. Grayson finally opened it. I didn't see what happened next, but I heard later that he was furious, shouting at them for interrupting his work and accusing them of undermining him. He apparently stormed out of the classroom and left the building shortly after. The unsettling part came next. When administration tried to follow up with the agency to report Mr. Grayson's behavior, they found there was no record of him being assigned to the school. In fact, the agency didn't have anyone by that name in their system at all. They double-checked with the other agencies we work with, but no one had any record of a Mr. Grayson being issued to cover for Mrs. Barnes. The school's own hiring system showed no recent applications or approvals for substitute staff. No one could figure out who he was or how he'd ended up in the classroom that morning. He'd signed in at reception like any normal visitor, but when they checked the CCTV, the footage showed him entering the school grounds on foot, carrying only a small bag. There was nothing in his appearance or behavior earlier in the day to suggest anything unusual, yet by the afternoon he had completely unraveled. The police were called, but they didn't seem particularly interested. They noted the incident and said they'd keep an eye out for anyone matching the description, but that was the last we heard. As far as I know, no one's seen or heard from Mr. Grayson since. Mrs. Barnes returned the following week, still recovering from her illness but eager to get back to work. When we told her what had happened, she was understandably shaken. She said she didn't know anyone named Grayson and had no idea why someone would impersonate a substitute teacher. The kids were reluctant to talk about it, though a few admitted they still felt uneasy in her classroom. Even now, I can't stop thinking about it. Who was he? How did he get past our hiring systems, and what was his goal? It wasn't just the strange behavior or the vanishing act, it was the way he seemed to target the students, breaking them down little by little. It's like he wanted to leave a mark, to make them feel small and afraid, and that's what unsettles me the most. The drama department at my university was always known for its ambitious productions. I wasn't a drama major, but when they announced open auditions for a new play, a dark psychological thriller, I decided to give it a shot. I'd always enjoyed acting as a hobby, and this seemed like a great way to meet people and try something new. I had no idea what I was getting into. The play was called Shadows of the Mind, written by a former student whose name none of us recognized. The director told us it was an unpublished script they'd found in the archives, a hidden gem. The story centered on a group of characters confronting their deepest fears in a mysterious, haunted house. It sounded eerie but manageable, nothing out of the ordinary for a college play. Rehearsals started normally enough. The script was intense, but everyone seemed excited to bring it to life. We worked late into the evenings, running lines, blocking scenes and building the set. The cast was a tight-knit group, and I quickly made friends with most of them. Everything seemed fine for the first few weeks. Then people started disappearing. It began with Jamie, one of the lead actors. He missed a rehearsal, which wasn't entirely unusual. People got sick or had emergencies. But when he didn't show up the next day, the director tried calling him, no answer. His flatmates said they hadn't seen him since the previous evening, and his things were still in his room. He was reported missing, and the rest of us tried to move on, though it was hard not to feel unsettled. A few days later, we noticed something strange in the script. Jamie's lines had changed. They were darker, more personal, referencing fears he'd casually mentioned during rehearsals, things he'd never shared with the writers or director. We thought it was some sort of sick joke. No one admitted to making the changes. Then another cast member, Sophie, vanished. Like Jamie, she'd left behind her belongings, her phone, and any trace of where she might have gone. The police came to interview us, but no one had any useful information. We were all on edge, but the director insisted the show must go on. That's when I started noticing changes to Sophie's lines too. They described a chillingly specific detail about how she would die, details that matched her worst fears. The changes to the script didn't stop there. The lines shifted almost daily, sometimes during rehearsals. The words seemed to appear on the pages overnight. More cast members disappeared. It became harder to dismiss the growing fear. The new lines were always disturbingly personal, revealing secrets and fears none of us had ever spoken aloud. By the time we were down to half the original cast, no one wanted to continue. The director, however, was adamant. They claimed cancelling the play would dishonor the legacy of the writer, who, they hinted, had died tragically young. The whole thing sounded ridiculous, but we were too afraid of looking paranoid or unprofessional to outright refuse. The night before opening, the remaining cast gathered for one final rehearsal. By now, every single one of us had found changes in our lines, disturbing personal changes, Mine had been altered to reference a fear I'd never told anyone about, being trapped in a dark, confined space. The script now described in detail how my character would die, locked in a tiny room with no light, no air, and no way out. Reading it made my stomach turn, but I didn't say anything. None of us did. That night, I stayed late to go over my lines one last time. The theatre was empty except for me and the director, who was in the office sorting out final logistics. As I sat on the stage, flipping through the pages, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The ending had changed. The final scene now described every cast member's death, one by one, in horrifying detail. My name was there, as was everyone else's, including the director's. I ran to show them, but when I got to the office, the door was ajar, the light flickering, and they were gone. I didn't wait to see if anyone else would vanish. I grabbed my things and left, not even bothering to lock up. The next day, I withdrew from the production and the drama program entirely. No one could get in touch with the rest of the cast, and the play was quietly cancelled. I didn't believe in ghosts before this, and honestly, I still don't know if I do, but what happened to me in the old wing of the university library has stuck with me. I'd heard the rumors like everyone else, the usual stuff about how it was haunted, how strange things happened to students who stayed too late. It sounded like typical campus folklore, the kind of story you tell to scare freshers. I laughed it off like everyone else. I wish I hadn't. I had an essay due the next day, and procrastination had left me scrambling. The main part of the library was bustling earlier in the evening, but by 10 p.m. it was dead quiet. I wasn't done yet, and since the old wing was open 24 hours for those with student cards, I figured I'd just move there for the last push. The old wing was nothing like the rest of the library. It felt like stepping back in time. The ceilings were high and vaulted, with dark wooden shelves that stretched up far. The lighting was dim. I sat up at one of the tables near the back, far from the main entrance, hoping to avoid the inevitable distraction of other students wandering by. Around 11:30, the librarian passed by. She gave me a look, one of those half-pitying, half-warning stares, but didn't say anything. I caught her glancing at the clock on the wall before she turned and left. I didn't think much of it. The quiet helped me focus, and I got through a good chunk of my work. Then, not long after the librarian left, I noticed the temperature drop. It wasn't gradual, it was like someone had flipped a switch. One moment, I was comfortable, and the next, my hands were freezing. I figured it was just the ancient heating system and tried to ignore it. Not long after, I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint creak like the sound of someone stepping on an old wooden floor. The thing is, the floor in the old wing is carpeted, and the sound came from somewhere behind me. I turned, expecting to see someone else, but the aisle behind my table was empty. I shrugged it off and went back to my notes, but the sound came again, closer. I decided to move to a different table. Maybe I was just being jumpy, I told myself. But as I packed up my things, I noticed something strange. The books on the shelves near where I was sitting were out of place. Several were sticking out as though someone had started to pull them but stopped. I hadn't touched them, and I was the only one there. I chose a table closer to the entrance and tried to focus again, but the atmosphere felt different now. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. Every tiny sound made me jump. The hum of the old lights, the occasional creak of the building settling, even my own breathing. Then came the whispering. I thought I was imagining it. It was faint. It sounded like a voice, though I couldn't make out any words. It came from the far end of the room where I'd been sitting before. It stopped for a moment, then started again, closer. It was time to leave. I packed up quickly, stuffing my notes into my bag without even organizing them. As I slung the bag over my shoulder, I heard another sound. This time it was a thud, like a book falling off a shelf. When I turned to look, a book was lying on the floor in the middle of the aisle. The shelf it had come from was meters away, and I was the only person there. I didn't wait to find out more. I walked quickly toward the entrance, trying not to run, but as I reached the door, it didn't budge. I swiped my student card, but the scanner blinked red. I tried again, but nothing happened. That's when I heard footsteps echoing through the room. They weren't coming from a specific direction. It was like the sound was all around me, reverberating off the walls. I turned, my heart pounding, and I saw movement at the far end of the room. A figure stepped out from one of the aisles, pale and indistinct, like smoke trying to take shape. It didn't have a face, not exactly, but I could feel it staring at me. The footsteps started again, this time faster, and the figure moved closer. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet or trying to make sense of what was happening. I just sprinted toward the emergency exit at the back of the room. It was locked too. The footsteps were right behind me now, and I could feel the air grow colder with every step. Then everything stopped. The footsteps, the cold, the whispers, all of it. When I turned, the figure was gone. The room was empty again, but the silence remained. I stood there shaking until I worked up the courage to try the main door again. This time it opened. I didn't look back as I left. I didn't even go back to my flat that night. I stayed with a friend, though I didn't tell them why. I haven't been back to the old wing since, and I make sure I'm out of the main library well before curfew. Whatever is in there, it doesn't want company. It was a total accident that I ended up outside the staff lounge that night. I'd stayed late at school to finish up a project in the art room, completely losing track of time. By the time I packed up and headed for the exit, the halls were deserted, and the usual buzz of school life was replaced by silence. That's when I heard a low murmur of voices coming from the staff lounge, which was odd because the place was usually empty after hours apart from the cleaners. I wasn't sure what to do. It's not like it was any of my business, but something about the tone of their voices made me pause. It didn't sound like casual chatter or a late-night meeting. It was hushed, almost conspiratorial, and it piqued my curiosity. I crept closer, trying to make out the words without being noticed. What I heard made my stomach drop. They were talking about students, not in the usual way teachers do, complaining about poor grades or disruptive behavior, but in a much darker way. They were mentioning specific names, kids from my year, and discussing them like they were pieces on a chessboard. Their words were clinical and unsettling, as if they were deciding fates rather than academic futures. I couldn't stop myself from peeking through the small window in the door. Inside, a handful of teachers sat around a table, papers and files spread out in front of them. I recognized all of them, my maths teacher, the history teacher, even the head of the English department. They all looked so ordinary, but the things they were saying didn't match the people I thought I knew. One teacher tapped a file on the table and made a comment that caused the others to nod in agreement. Their expressions grim but determined. The more I listened, the more twisted it became. They weren't just discussing the students' academic struggles or personal issues. They were talking about what they called necessary removals and adjustments. It sounded like they were deciding who would fail, who would be ostracized, and worst of all, who might simply disappear. There was an air of finality to their words, as if these decisions were already set in motion. I felt frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. One of the names they mentioned was someone I knew, a quiet kid from my biology class who'd been absent a lot lately. They spoke about him in past tense, like he was already gone. Another name they brought up was one of my close friends. They described her as problematic and an obstacle. I wanted to burst in and demand answers, but the fear rooted me to the spot. Then something even more chilling happened. One of the teachers stood up and walked to the door, as if sensing someone was there. I barely had time to duck around the corner before the door creaked open and their footsteps echoed in the empty hallway. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. After a moment, they went back inside, but I didn't dare stick around any longer. I bolted out of the school, my mind racing. I tried to convince myself I'd misunderstood, that it wasn't as sinister as it seemed, but I couldn't shake the way they spoke, the casual way they seemed to decide the futures or fates of people I knew. The next day, I watched my teachers closely, looking for any sign that what I'd overheard was real. They acted normal, smiling and chatting as if nothing had happened, but then I noticed something else. The quiet kid they'd mentioned wasn't in class, and no one seemed to know where he was. My friend, the one they'd called an obstacle, started avoiding school altogether, saying she felt unsafe but couldn't explain why. The coincidences piled up, and the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that what I'd overheard wasn't a misunderstanding. I haven't told anyone about that night. Who would believe me? But I can't unhear their words or forget the look on their faces as they discussed us like we were pawns in some twisted game. I don't stay late at school anymore, and I've started keeping to myself. Something's very wrong here, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that they know I was there. I was. When I first moved into my dormitory, the curfew rules struck me as odd. The pamphlet we received during orientation made it clear no one was allowed outside their rooms after 10 p.m. sharp. The resident advisor repeated the rules at our first meeting, her tone firm. She said it wasn't negotiable. Anyone caught outside their room after curfew would face what they called the silence. No one elaborated on what that meant, but there was something about the way she said it, something unsettling. The first few nights were uneventful. The curfew wasn't hard to follow. By 10 p.m., the halls were empty, the building quiet. I assumed the rule was just a way to keep things orderly, maybe a way to prevent partying or disturbances. The building itself was old, with creaky floors and dim lighting. It had a heavy atmosphere, and the silence at night only added to its strange aura. One night I stayed up late studying. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, so I was alone in the room. Around midnight, I started to hear faint footsteps in the hall. They were soft, like someone trying not to be heard. I froze, my pen hovering over my notebook. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to my door. It wasn't uncommon for people to break curfew, but the way the steps moved, they were slow, not the hurried pace of someone sneaking back to their room. They stopped right outside my door. My heart pounded as I stared at the handle, half expecting it to turn. Then came the knocking. It was frantic, desperate, the sound of someone in panic. I didn't move. I couldn't. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but the fear rooted me in place. The knocking continued for what felt like an eternity before it abruptly stopped, and then silence. No creaking floors, no distant voices, no hum of the radiator. I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the door. I wanted to open it to see what was happening, but the rules echoed in my mind. Don't break curfew. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Eventually, I crawled into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child hiding from a nightmare. The silence stretched on through the night. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The hall was empty, the same as always. When I stepped out to use the bathroom, I noticed a faint scuff mark on the floor outside my door, as if someone had been dragging their feet. I tried to ask a couple of other students if they'd heard anything, but no one did, or at least didn't want to talk about it. The following night, I couldn't shake the tension. Every sound in the building seemed amplified. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop at my door. They moved slowly down the hall, pausing occasionally, as if whoever it was listening. Then came the knocking on someone else's door this time. The same frantic, panicked rhythm, and again it stopped abruptly, followed by that unnatural silence. The next morning I noticed the room where the knocking had been was empty. The student who lived there didn't return, and no one seemed to question it. Their belongings were gone within a day, as if they'd never been there at all. By the end of the week, I realized no one talked about the curfew beyond the initial warnings. If anyone else heard the footsteps or the knocking, they didn't mention it. I became paranoid, counting down the minutes until 10 p.m. each night, dreading the possibility of hearing the sounds again. The last night I stayed in that dorm, it happened one more time. The footsteps came first, louder this time, faster. The knocking started, frantic and erratic, moving from door to door. It was as if someone was trying to wake the entire floor, desperate for help. When it reached my door, I held my breath, clutching the edge of my blanket. The knocking was more violent than before, shaking the thin wooden door, and then silence. I packed my things the next morning and requested a transfer to another dorm. I didn't care about the hassle or the strange looks from the staff. I just couldn't stay there. No one ever explained what the silence was or why the curfew existed, and I didn't want to find out.